Tetsuko, should we begin? And then,
Yes,
yeah,
I was
okay.
I
just
think we can. Yeah.
checking. All right, hold on. I have thousands tabs open, so I want to make sure that I have the right um, page open in front of me. Voila. All right.
Hmm.
Well, welcome everyone to the DHAsia webinar. My name is Setsuko Yokoyama, an assistant professor of digital humanities at Singapore University of Technology and Design. And I am today's host. As you know, this webinar is organized by a group of scholars doing DH in Asia, including representatives from India, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, mainland China, and Singapore. And I'd like to thank all the organizers who make this series possible. So let me paste their names in the chat to acknowledge their behind-the-scene contributions. This is a growing team, and if you are interested in organizing side of DH work, you are welcome to reach out any one of us in the region. All right, now let me introduce you to today's moderator, Dr. Nirmala Menon, professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Department of English, IIT Indore, who's currently took over a dean's position and reporting from the dean's office. So welcome. If you're keen on learning more about a postcolonial and decolonial DH approach, I recommend, among many writings that she's published, her piece on the in the global debates in the digital humanities anthology, No Making That Now, Decolonizing Digital Humanities in South Asia. And again, among many pieces, but let me copy paste that chapter in the chat. All right, now thank you, Dr. Menon, for agreeing to moderate today's session. Could you introduce today's speaker for us?
Yeah. Good morning, afternoon to all of you. And thank you, Setsuko, for doing this series, on Asian DH, because I think it is such an important part of digital humanities globally. And I think in all our different spaces, we do such interesting and diverse work that really adds to the production of knowledge. So thank you so much for doing this. And our speaker for today, Professor Maya Dodd, is a very dear colleague and someone who has been working in the area of digital humanities, since I have been in India, and I think she has been in Stanford and other places, right? And together we have tried to have a kind of a collective conversation about DH in India. So I will be, well, before I give her formal introduction to her, I would like to let everyone know that Dr. Maya and myself are series editors for a series of digital scholarship in Asia from Routledge. Right. The first book in that series is one that the two of us have edited and will be out soon this year. But the reason that, and Setsuko, we will share a CFP with you that you can share with everyone else. The reason I want to mention that is that we would love to have proposals from across Asia, from different countries. And if you have a proposal in mind for a edited collection or a monograph in DH within, doing DH in Asia, please get in touch with us. So with that, I want to introduce Professor Maya Dodd, who currently is the director of the Flame Center for Legislative Education and Research at Flame University, Pune. She received a PhD from Stanford University and subsequent postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton and JNU in India. She teaches digital cultures in the Department of Humanities and has pioneered teaching digital humanities in the liberal arts at the undergraduate level. And, kind of manifested in some of our groups of students who have won awards for their projects at international forums. So do check those out too. and she's very, modest here. And she also supervises doctoral students for DH study in India. Through the ownership of Public History in India grant from the British Academy, she has been exploring tools for cultural archiving via techniques from DH. She serves as an editor for the Routledge series on digital humanities in Asia and has also been a part of several initiatives such as the Milli Consortium dedicated to nurturing archives in India and service to building digital humanities scholarship via the Dharti Collective. In collaboration, she's currently developing a new project of digitizing Pune's architectural history from 1920 to 1980. She's recently been invited to be a part of the Global Advisory Board based at the University of Rochester that will support the work of the humanities in the world. So this is really a very small snapshot of all the things that Maya does and that she conspires to do. And as a co-conspirator, I'm so happy to welcome her today for her talk that is titled Locating Digital Archives for an Indian Digital Commons. So
Thank
over to you,
you.
Maya.
Thank you so much, Nirmala. You always make me blush. And in the meanwhile,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how eager I am to have this conversation today. One, of course, for the reason that this is addressed to a digital humanities audience, which we rarely honestly get a chance to do. I think a lot of our work is in the realm of advocacy, kind of, letting people know digital humanities exists and things like that. And I think this conversation has really come at this particular moment when both Dharti and the Korean DH Association and a bunch of new sort of Asian presences are now being registered in the international stage for digital humanities. So I figure that, we're at a good point to reflect about where we're going, where we've been. And for that reason, I'm posing today's talk really as a conversation, and I really hope you prove me wrong. So please, it's an invitation for a lot of cross-questioning. And also, this is stuff I've been experiencing, and maybe that's my specific experience. So that's why I say that if I'm wrong, I'm only too happy. Having said that, I'll share my slide. And obviously, Zoom has so many controls that you don't know what you're doing most of the time. I think it's great. Okay. So the word locating is very strategic in the sense that it's a ongoing process. I wish we knew. And this is coming from different attempts at quest, in terms of finding where we can look for primary sources specifically for contemporary Indian history. And I will sort of say this in three parts. I'm going to try and be speedy, but essentially it's an argument that requires sort of two things to be identified. One is the story of open access, but more importantly, what is it that we currently have in terms of, doing research on contemporary India. Now, I know the room is filled with scholars from different parts of Asia, and I hope that your story is different, and I think the Indian story is complicated because of the scale and the sort of, multilingual landscape that we inhabit. But I wonder if there is sort of a similar challenge in different parts of, this continent. And please let me know if you face the same problem. So I'm pasting for you something which has been on the internet since the late 1990s. And, rarely do legacy sort of websites have yet relevance. But in this case, it actually does. And I'll tell you why. For the reason that a lot of what they sort of depict, this was a family that sort of put up, history resources in the early days. And I will switch a tab to sort of show you how they did it. They use very traditional sources, in terms of Indological really reference points. And they really have a how we know what we know question. And it goes back to the epics and ancient archaeology, Greek accounts, Chinese accounts, Islamic accounts. And it sort of stops short basically at medieval India in terms of resource wealth, right? Now, obviously, the past is very finite. And in another sense, the timeline of 5,000 years is very neatly captured, right, in that sense. But as you can see, there's this sort of brief nod to the 2000s. But in terms of, how do you say this? In terms of primary sources, you would imagine there is so much more for the 20th century and for the contemporary moment, right? Obviously, we're profuse with evidence. So why is this a problem? I mean, this seems to be a contrarian sort of claim to say that, why do we have less as opposed to more? Now, the question then takes us to where do you look for information when you're studying? I'm talking about contemporary India, okay? I mean, really the last 75 odd years. where do you start looking? And I have to mention, of course, the efforts made by the Indian state to collate the information under sort of specific umbrellas. I know Japan also has done this in terms of the diet library, in terms of that effort. But really, the state is but one actor in this very complex landscape. The InflibNet, what do you call it, effort starts a long time ago, I think in the late 90s, actually. Of course, there's attempts at creating digital spaces. There's the National Digital Library of India. I'm trying to sort of be quick, so the links are embedded. I'm happy to share the deck if people want to pursue these links. And so there is sort of that umbrella of trying to get Indian content under a government kind of platform. In the meanwhile, you have something like the Digital South Asia Library hosted at U Chicago, which had a lot of information, but very honestly, very little of it is downloadable at any meaningful resolution. And I will say that, and as I said, please tell me I'm wrong. Things have been changing rapidly because of open access. But in any case, we need to sort of keep in mind. The Wayback Machine, very interestingly, as you know, with the Internet Archive, has been archiving ever since the dawn of the Internet. And as of today, not today, 22, this is what ChatGPT told me, it holds about 570 billion archive pages. So the rapidity of how much is coming at us is very real. And in the meantime, Born Digital might have a better chance at, being accessible. But certainly there is this gap between very, very ancient historical sources and very, very contemporary ones. And by contemporary, I mean things like newspapers and, things that are everyday artifacts. All right, so where do we begin, right? And of course, we have very wonderful guides that exist across many North American universities that tell us where to look. I'm going to refer, to the Library of Congress one first. And I say this because I want to show you something. I hope you can see my screen, the Library of Congress research. Okay, great. Now, when you look at South Asian studies in this frame, what you see is two tabs, subscription and free. In subscription, you see obviously things which are on site only. And there's a very extensive list, right? And I'm kind of walking all of us through it because if there's something that, works for other regions, even more exciting. There's everything from Australian thing, British campaigns, colonial records, East India Company, African and such. Then there is the Buddhist Digital Resource Center. And this interestingly gets created as a non-profit, founded in 1999, and holds a digital library of the largest collection of digitized Tibetan texts and, of course, Pali, Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan. Now, Buddhist manuscript culture and also just the efforts of digitization have been uniquely cooperative across the Asian region. And of course, we know why that is. There is so much that exists in one language is registered, but not in the other. So famously in India, actually, Dr. Ambedkar was extremely critical in getting many texts translated, from other languages, into English and such. So this kind of multilingual register is uniquely, I think, successful in this digitization effort. And then we have others, which I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But what I need you to understand is all of these resources are on site, barring a few of the the digital libraries. Empire Online, Encyclopedia of Islam, Hebrew printing in India, India Raj and Empire, and so on, music online, etc. Okay. Now, this is obviously many of these are state records. They're held by governments, so they're located in libraries, and you have to go there to visit and access. When you look at the free databases, and this is what gets really interesting, many of these are not coming from government spaces, right? So the 1947 Partition Archive, for instance, is not officially being held up as a torch by any South Asian government. It's a citizen created effort and it's done wonderfully well. Abhilekh Patal is something that comes much later. It is the National Archives portal to access digital collections. But it's very much a trickle because only when you accessed in the analog would they digitize. And now there's this insane effort to make it all available online, but it's so speedy that there's lots of questions about whether it'll actually be of quality. And that's the metadata question, and we can talk about that. And then, of course, things like the American Institute of Different Regions has tried, again, citizen efforts like Banglapedia. Vichitra was state-sponsored, but executed at Jadavpur, and that should be mentioned as a big win, early win with the Bengali OCR. And then, of course, a lot of manuscript cultures, which are, again, uh, necessarily digital because they are fragile, and digital access prevents people from destroying things further and more. So I'm not going to overkill it, but you get the point. Digital Himalaya also, is a project that comes, as a cooperative one and such. So all of these are more in the realm of accessible. But as you can see, we sort of are looking at Gandhari, Mughal, things which are fairly ancient, honestly. And I'm talking about the challenge with contemporary Indian primary sources. So that's where this kind of gap becomes very apparent. A lot of Buddhist Asian art and such. And then, of course, this interesting thing about the question about newspapers, and we'll get back to that because that's a critical side of evidence for contemporary things. On the religious front, whether it's the Jain e-library, just like the Buddhist canon, many successful ventures. It's very sweet that they mentioned the Kamath timeline I showed you, because obviously this was very homegrown, but actually it was very useful for classrooms in India. If you wanted to show them the quick sweep of Indian history, it was a clean place to start, but it has other issues, and I'll show you what they are later. And of course, in Pakistan, LUMS, Digital Archive, etc. So I'm going on and on, but you get the point. The point basically being that none of these are really official sanctioned spaces often. They're just projects that made something happen. So we have all these different guides. And another guide that I think is very interesting because it points to the future of maybe where scholarship goes is the new digital sort of scholarship guides, right? So in the case of, let's say, Princeton's digital humanities sort of reading lists, etc., there are a few mentions. And then we go to databases. So the old school bibliography has been replaced by the database. And we clearly see this, right? When you're looking specifically for a text or for a sound clip or for interviews, let's say from this partition archive, etc., you get that. And then some wonderful efforts like this one about the history of print, by Professor Stark at Chicago, etc. So the point being that the database replaces in a way the text, and that enables us to see yet more, yet more evidence and more primary sources to be populated. And something like this was necessary. This is a great project by a wonderful person, Farah Yamin, and more people, of course, where 1970s India, which is not really that recent and not really that old, is something that needed collation in terms of the living people who remembered events like the emergency. So they have listen, watch, read, right? That combination of sources of audiovisual, etc., matters greatly for just sort of recalling the past in different ways. So digital, I think, guides become the hybrid space of where to look, right? All right. Now, as I mentioned in the previous list, a lot of this stuff has come from the ground up. And the book coming out this year, edited by Nirmala and myself, is featuring a lot of these efforts because I feel they need to be celebrated more. And they come from precisely this gap of the official and the unofficial kind of requiring a suture, and this suture is coming from publishers like Zuban, individually funded platforms like Sahapedia and Pari. I'll show you some more about that. And sort of very, very brave and persistent people chronicling events like in the case of Nandini Oza, Oral History Narmada, and more. Anybody needs any more references, I'm happy to talk later. But in the same way that the older Punjab Digital Library, Project Madura, etc., were very much ground up efforts coming from the love of the language, oftentimes with diaspora, you see the same thing happening. Okay. So now the point about the earlier efforts was that they really were, okay, no, this is not what I'm, okay. They were, coming from collections or from, sorry, I'm just trying to open this while I talk, which clearly I'm not good at doing. So yeah, they were coming from citizen-led efforts, and they were also coming from people who are building them, right? And the building part is extremely important because of the fact that it takes real labor. We know digital labor is real. It doesn't actually just sort of magically appear by outsourcing it to a vendor. It still takes very patient, Now I found this very interesting because when you're looking at the question of collecting and the question of who's building, right? It is not an overnight effort. we often think of digital archiving as something where, you can, like the National Archives is currently doing, where you say, hey, we want this collection to just be available online, and somehow behind the scenes, people just make it happen. But if you look at the longer history of collecting, and therefore, this is an American example, I know, but the point is the timeline, right? It is looking at 1770 to 2010 in the case of this collection. And obviously, you can spend more time looking at individual years, and I'm not doing a good job here. But yeah, somebody like Peggy Guggenheim obviously is collecting art at a different pace. And so you see the labor that goes into not just the labor, the capital and the time sort of that goes into building these collections, which is a great way of tracing where the past lies, which is which archives, what location. And this is a directory of archives, this particular one, freight.org. Now, obviously, we're a far ways away from creating that for India, but the point is that often what you see, is that people do it for specific subjects, right? So let's say you're looking at archaeology. This is a really fabulous website, TDAR. I don't know. I'm not an archaeologist, so I don't know how it's used. But in any case, you have the Library of Congress, of course, digital libraries. There's the VNA archive, right? And you know that some of it is open and some of it is not. But in the meantime, what's interesting is about the impetus to create access, right? And that impetus is coming from these digital objects coming out of these curated collections being made available to people online. So the Digital Public Library of America, fabulous thing, free digital access, even to banned books, interesting, and more. And it comes from this sort of public library movement, from the idea of even borrowing something. Even the Internet Archive has the idea of borrowing a digital, file, right? So it's not necessarily an ownership model. It is just about, kind of piecing the two things together. Now that brings us to the next question of, so obviously the Library of Congress and the British Library have massive collection, and they're so massive that I would actually try to do this comparison. The Library of Congress has 170 million items. British Library has over 200 million. These numbers don't compute for me, but obviously it means it's a lot. And then the question next one is, so they have all this stuff. How much of this access do we get online? Now, you might wonder, why am I referring to the Library of Congress or the British Library when I'm talking about locating an Indian digital commons, right? And the truth of the matter is, I don't think I have to repeat the story of empire, but a lot of the earlier materials are reposed there. In the case of the British Library, clearly for colonial reasons. In the case of Library of Congress, it's because of a very peculiar sort of series of accidents, you can say, historical accidents, one of which was this legislation called PL 480, whereby in exchange for grain, this was starting in the 70s, India would send over to about, I think it was 5 designated libraries in the US, every single book that was ever published. This could be government, private, in any language. So what we saw is places like University of Chicago, I think it was, sorry, I'm really bad at this, maybe Austin, Berkeley, Michigan, Michigan or Wisconsin, sorry. A few of these got literally everything that was ever published, especially government circulars, election manifestos, all kinds of very interesting things housed in these libraries. And oftentimes the only existing copies in these libraries. So now that's where the Library of Congress becomes really significant for Indian holdings, just as the British Library was for imperial, sort of memory. Sorry, please ignore the density of this slide. I'm apologizing in advance, but I'll be speedy on telling the story. So, okay, so I'm pushing on this question of how do we access stuff? Where do we access stuff? And who's helped us do it? I told you InflipNet was old. I forgot how old. Now we know 1991, which sounds almost strange. Interestingly, the year that India gets economic liberalization. And it's beginning to build this consortium idea of access, right? But this is still in the analog world first, and then it goes digital. By 2008, we've understood in India that all the scholarship that comes out of Indian universities is often opaque to people outside and even to people inside. And so this idea of creating a platform for all theses to be reposed comes through Shodh Ganga. Shodh means actually discover or find. So it is actually a portal for discovery for Indian scholarship. Now, please note the slide is titled Scholarly Open Access. So there's the other argument, and this one is about scholarship. In the case of the National Knowledge Network, again, they're connecting academic institutions. And then, as I mentioned, Abhilekh Patal comes a little later, 2013, which, is not that, old. but it's been a minute in terms of them putting things up there. And then Nirmala knows the story much better than I do. The efforts at kind of joining up with Coalition S by 2020, which don't work out and such. So we have a variety of efforts of putting the National Archives online, the National Digital Library in 2016, and the DST, the Department of Science and Tech, which has got massive funding, saying that, look, open access should be a mandate for a country like India. It should be a mandate. And in the meanwhile, as much as scholarly sort of open access receives a lot of attention, sorry, I'm not, okay. Yeah, what we also need to think about is the idea of a digital library for open publics, not only for scholars, right? Because in India, we've had a fairly rigid and very successful, I would say, attempt at blocking curious people from accessing just knowledge, right? And it's knowledge for the reason of, let's say, primary sources for historical evidence, as I mentioned, newspapers, which are now behind paywalls, etc. So open access, in the way I'm talking about it, is not only scholarly open access, it is literally access to just, things that people should have. And I will not bore you with reading the slide, but you understand that, there is a definition of all of this from library science and others. And the point is, so much research in India, in the US, in Australia, in the UK, around the world is publicly funded. It's funded by governments. And the simple argument is this is public, it belongs back in the commons. If it's funded by state governments on taxpayer money, it obviously belongs back in the commons, and we get this logic. So as much as I am very appreciative of the private players in this space, I think finally, it is beyond academia, and it is beyond, how do you say this, only, individual effort, right? Now, if you look at the case of the law, you see obviously the need for a lot of archiving in terms of, judgments and case law. And if you look at this is just because, it is the efforts that have been created around creating access for case law. The Supreme Court of India, you can access free judgments. Certain ones like these ones, Manupatra, LexisNexis, of course, are not free and open, and yet they're very rich sites of evidence. Judicial databases also sometimes charge a fee depending on what you're asking for. And similarly, the high courts, etc., are also not absolutely open. Now, this matters because you would think rights and, asking for access to case law is everyone's, prerogative. But in any case, that's one example of perhaps publicly funded, publicly salient archiving that people should have access to. So coming to the general public, right? I'm moving out of the scholarly space and saying just curious people, want to know things. What do they do? Now, in the case of the South Asian Canadian Digital Archive, they create things themselves. They go out there, they collect oral histories, and we have people like I see Ishita in the room, there are people who are doing it in India also, which is to say, look, we'll figure this out on our own. People like the Heritage Lab, this is Midhavi Gandhi and company, they also have a chapter in the book. They have looked at what is already in the open domain to create greater engagement. So they'll run campaigns like art and feminism and such. And it's really to kind of get folks to take seriously, just look at what's out there, right? I mean, as much as we're flooded by a profusion of supposedly sources, oftentimes when we're looking for something specific, we are hit with a problem. You'll be surprised, anthologies like Women Writing in India, they are actually, again, sort of scholarly efforts at just taking stock. The accounting process itself has really begun only since the 90s. And so I understand why the challenges to kind of contemporary collation have been not unique, to India, but in any case. Now, I want to draw us now to this bridge perhaps between the scholarly and the open public. And the scholarly, as you see, Library of Congress and many other universities, etc., offer stuff. But the more interesting story, I think, is when the Smithsonian in the US or the Project Trove in Australia involve the open public. So just like we are somehow duty bound to fill up the CAPTCHA, that lets us help them with typographic confusion. Similarly, these projects where people can be digital volunteers, can kind of help with transcription, can engage their history more, have been very successful. And I think that is the way forward for everyone. Why did this problem strike us? Because when we were working on this project, the ownership of public history in India, it was shocking to us that people's access to their own histories is woefully small, if not non-existent. And this should never be the case. I know history is a very, very fraught area, but in the meanwhile, the fact is that this kind of for us, by us model should have been the story for a long time. I'm sorry, I know I have very little time. So these are just examples, and please check them out if you would like to, of people who are not just using history for scholarship, but really in terms of using it as a jump off for imagination, like in the case of the spectral archive, medical history, not just about what is there, but how did it come to be, right? History where the personal and the collective kind of gets scaled because it becomes not just your story, but your story, kind of like partition archive in a bigger story. And then things like food history that become big data. And of course, our students love doing this, a lot of remixing. So this is a rap battle between Mahatma Gandhi and MLK, not everyone's flavor. But the point is that when you have access to prime resources, there is so much you can do, right? Imagine the future differently, imagine the past differently, fill in the blanks of things that you didn't quite understand. And of course, community history, which, people really, oh, sorry, this was my slide, which is why digital pedagogy matters, because suddenly you've amplified access to so much evidence, and you have also enabled collaboration of the public with the scholarly, remixing across, archival spaces, and designing really for use, right? It's not just that the classroom is the only space of learning. Now that we've expanded our boundaries to much outside the classroom, I think we need to kind of involve people. So now the next question becomes, I moved from very closed spaces to talking about kind of hybrid and such virtual libraries. There are 3 platforms I'd like to mention. Are they 3 or more? This should be 1 more. 4. One is missing. Okay. One is openverse.org. The other one is the search engine for Creative Commons, which is fantastic because it's all unlicensed content. If you're looking to capture for your class or for some historical project, rhizome.org and curationist.org. All 4 are very useful for open access search. I think we are being bludgeoned by copyright in a time when it is meaningless, frankly, for what people do. And I think most digital humanities scholars will agree that we do the invisible labor of databasing and platforming and all of that, only to be like met with these walls. And so to kind of really return back to the commons, as of today, this is what I know. I mentioned the Digital Public Library of America, like Europeana. These things exist for Asia, for Europe, for the US, but not yet for Asia. And that's why this particular audience is very special to me, because I think that when you're looking at sites, this is a very old site. I mean, it's a site called harappa.com, so it's also historically about an older time. What you see really is, okay, 2,000 pages by leading scholars of Indus Valley civilization, old film clips, etc., whatever. Whatever they could find, they scraped together, they put together. But if you're looking at things like the Buddhist canon that I mentioned, etc., that came really from monasteries, from funding that was not always in the university system. And that, I think, is the way forward for imagining an Asian platform for a Europeana or Digital Public Library styled discovery platform. I looked at, for instance, Digital Humanities Japan, Korea, and I do notice a lot of what they're doing is actually classical in orientation. A lot of it, even the DH Taiwan, sorry, I forgot the name, Taiwanese Association of Digital Humanities. Much of it comes from sort of philology, generally civilizational kind of areas. I'm wondering, and that is still the easy stuff, right? The Buddhist canon, etc., is in a way imaginable as capturable. What do we do with the contemporary? How do we look at the rise of manga in India? How do we understand, that these things are so infectious that we to think of it as only this time and only this place is so foolish that the platform is really urgently required. So we're going to move now from, oh yeah, this was the curationist platform. It was, launched fairly recently. I don't remember when, but in any case, it was for, yeah. And the point is that you can search 4.4 million artifacts on this platform. I'm not like overwhelmed with numbers, but I will compare the South Asian Open Archives and tell you that has about 30,000. And look at the scale. And I'm not trying to be, the trader in the room measuring everything. But what I'm saying is Asia, obviously the number is going to be staggering. The challenge is going to be insane in terms of multilingual. and not to mention how metadata works for this. But I think one of the answers, so I posed the question and I'm trying to take a stab at the answer. It's a modest proposal, which is that to use wikis as a start point in terms of how multilingual and crowdsourced and open access have worked beautifully might be a way forward to developing a platform for iteration, survey, and search. And not just iteration, I mean, obviously for global. Sorry. So the way that it's worked is also in terms of the GLAM sector. And there is it's called, I think it's called Open GLAM for Open Wiki. Sorry, I forgot what it's called. But the point is that it's actually for the GLAM sector, the gallery, library, art gallery, museum, to kind of think about how are you making your digital object discoverable. And the way you have to do it is first at the metadata level, you actually think in terms of linked open data. And there's a vision to this, to say, in the future, I hope this is discoverable. Sorry, it's a borrowed slide from Wikimedia. But really, this is how, and Rhizome is their platform. Yeah, it's really for the born digital in terms of discovery and also interoperability, right, for that. Now, everyone's talked about metadata as being very, very important, but I wanted to point us to something new, which is really also going to be important in an era of AI and fake news and many such things. I hope you can see this screen. It's Uppsala University. Oh gosh, I don't know what I'm doing, but okay. So yeah, so therefore, the focus here is actually not metadata, but paradata. Now, paradata meaning what? How did this metadata get created? Their focus in this project is archaeological data, but I think it's even more significant for contemporary data because we are going to be asking questions of provenance and veracity and validity and how do we sort of establish those. So for that reason, I think this paradata really is the way forward in terms of, yeah, sorry, I had a slide which I didn't realize I had, for thinking about the how we know what we know question, okay? And this paradata, I think, is also another reason, of course, I'm now making more than a modest proposal for an Asian platform, to going forward. I just for relief for your eyes to not be bludgeoned by only text. Of course, we have already existing government archives. Now imagine this is the, not just Indian, but South Asian. And of course, we were all one at some point. So in every sense, it makes sense for our past to also be connected. The government sort of archives, if they had linked open data, discoverable, really. The same goes for British Library and their archives. Same goes for digital archives, that meaning government, crowdsourced, private collectors, right? So imagining these all in conversation, and this is a very long slide, sorry, which I mean, the scroll is very long, but really this was an audit of what was open, what was partial, what was behind a paywall. And it matters, it matters for when you are trying to find, when you're trying to find content, sorry, now you can see it, yeah. So if you're looking for music content, is it open? If you're looking for, let's say, specific collections like the Jain library we talked about, yes. Then when we're looking at things in universities like the Bombay Poets collection, which is in Cornell University, not open and such. So this audit actually really matters in terms of, making sense of what's going to come. And again, as I mentioned, a lot of the early archiving and collecting was coming from project work like this. But really, I think the point is we live in a time where we're already almost digital first. So if something is missing from the digital and missing from being accessed, it's a severe memory lapse for the public's history, right? So for all those reasons, things like the pamphlet collection at Duke University or the 1947 Partition Archive or the Library of Congress's most amazing, collections of many things. This is a very interesting, again, example. I'm just going to end here, which is a very early recording that was done. This was in the year 2000, so 24 years old, where they were recording world literature. So across languages, they did this. And so the only simple thing that the Library of Congress did was to archive, just like the Wayback Machine would do so, saying that let's put this on our portal. And it makes it discoverable ever after, no? So that's why there is some kind of joy to this. In the meanwhile, this book, which of course is now extremely ancient because it came out in 2020, has a follow-up, which Nirmala and we, are sort of drumming about. And through these efforts of kind of bringing attention to community archives and to other work, hopefully we create more access, more interoperability, and more accountability, right, for us all. Already this is happening from private spaces like PARI, the People's Archive of Rural India, the Citizens Archive of India. They're doing phenomenal work with contemporary memory. And by that, I mean oral history, looking back, but also what's present, both ways. And the hope is that we create new, smarter digital publics by doing this. Sorry, I thought I'm done, but I'm not. In the meantime, we have a crisis of contemporary data, even in the social sciences. So I think that it's not just about us, it's about multiple registers that require comparison. And one of the people, sorry, not people, one of the institutions doing it is really Millie. I'm a part of Millie, so I have to sort of mention this. There's a lot of attempt at just chronicling. Sessions are online. Please go to millie.link for that. And you can always email me for any more information you might need. So happy to do this and so happy to be told I'm totally wrong. And there are many, many open access archives I just don't know about. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. That was just amazing. So wonderful. And I was just noticing that I think, Shanmuga just proved that she's my student, because I was also thinking that Paradata is great. Like, that sounds like a amazing way to think, because, you're always kind of frustrated with metadata, right? And you're kind of always, there are always ways in which you feel that metadata needs to be more and more nuanced and contextual, and, and yet oftentimes, the challenges of actually getting that metadata in that format, by the time you get there, you need it a little bit more granular, right? And so how do we keep pace with that? I think one of the challenges of all that you talked about is also the pace of technology, right? That the pace of technology is changed a lot, and and which is why the digital platforms, archives, repositories are still not a stable resource, right? So if we think, like, I was discussing in one of my classes, if we think of the book now as a stable technology, we are still not there where we think of the digital as a stable technology. So, you're always trying to keep up. You're always trying to, do, see how you can, what is it? Like, transfer, so interoperability itself has become a very complex term, right? I mean, interoperability seemed like an operability between a set group of stable systems. Now that itself is not a constant, right? And so how do we kind of think through that interoperability, right? I want to open it up for questions from everyone, but I do think that, I'll just touch on one small point, which is that I think, when you were talking about Coalition S, and all the conversation that you talk about in terms of archives and repositories and creating digital commons, and like you showed, I think that there are some really good and open ones too, though there needs to be more, right? I think what we lack is in that step towards that, which is why Coalition has failed, right? That kind of publishing ecosystem, right? So we have, so in terms of scholarly publishing, that publishing ecosystem in a multilingual space is still at a stage where we don't have that kind of peer review process in place, even though we have open journal systems. Some of those OJS systems itself are not, compatible with different scripts. So, we are facing all of those challenges in that real-time publishing thing. And then, we go on to the archives and repositories, right? So I think that is where that link is, if you link between what I think and care very deeply about, and then where you also, you kind of think very, intellectually deliberate upon, right? So I don't want to take up, a lot of time, because I do that anyway with Maya. So I will open it up for questions from anyone. You can either raise your hand and they can ask their questions, right, Setsuko? They can just unmute themselves. Yeah. So please go ahead.
Please tell me I'm wrong. the earnest hope that there's a secret archive we just don't know about. Yeah, I think
Yes, Takahiro, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm Taka. I work at SUTD. I'm a colleague of Setsuko. So my question is about access to digital archives as a public. And you mentioned, so the question is whether there is a difference in the case of India in terms of accessibility for people within the state of India and those outside. You mentioned a few cases of, Japanese archives, but as a person living outside Japan, it's not actually the easiest to use because some digital archives, some digital resources are limited to those who live in the country or who registered in the country. And I've tried to use a few digital resources in Taiwan. And in order to register, you need a local mobile phone number. And I know some governments do this for political reasons, so I'm not saying that they should all just open it to the public and everything. So it's a difficult issue, I believe. But I just wanted to know whether India has any challenges in that direction and whether that has any bearings on this, the role of public and, especially people living outside the country to form the narrative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Takahiro, because I think that comparative kind of point is what we're looking for, right? Is it uniquely us? Is it everyone? How does this go? So first and foremost, I think what is available online is a fraction of what actually exists. And perhaps this is true of all of our cultures yet, right? Because I feel like digitization has become the new reason of state. This kind of, it's like this pipe dream of open access where you really, like sell it almost as saying, and this is what the National Archives is touting in India, that within 2 years, every piece of everything in that building is going to be online. Now, incidentally, that building is actually being renovated. So the entire holding is actually being invisibilized first to then later on be visible digitally, right? And the trickier thing, like you said, this is interesting, right? How do you deny access or deprive people, let's put it this way, of access? You never do it explicitly. It's always very subtle. One is you just don't make certain things available. The second is you create a fairly long list of criteria to even access something, like the mobile phone, or are you a citizen of the country? What do you require? So if you go to the National Archives, you have to fill in a lot of this. And even if you're a research scholar in a very prestigious or whatever university, there's a lot of scrutiny. And now much more so, honestly. Now it is very much about why are you researching this? So it's even one step worse. So I think that we would like to believe, because of the high risk of in-person archival access, the digital archive would be the answer. But unfortunately, it's very fractional in terms of what it offers. So that means even us looking would rather go to the actual physical premises than imagine that we're going to get. So I mean, people living in the country also don't have infinite, not infinite, but like total, transparency. So I think there's transparency and there's access, and they're a little different. Transparently speaking, there will be the claim that yes, all this is going to be available to you online, but how much of it is not, we never know. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think there is a real recognition of citizenship becoming like a legitimacy of why you're allowed to even research. And that's becoming really scary. I think this may be true of Hong Kong, this may be true of many other places right now, where it shouldn't be that way, right? And especially in a global world where people are living in different places. And if you want to know your past, you don't have to be a citizen of the country to know your past. So odd. Yeah. But thank you. That was very good to know the Taiwan thing. Yeah.
Fascinating.
I
Thank you
think
very
there is
much.
always a way in which, governments and other authorities limit access.
Yeah,
And as Mike said,
exactly.
it is never done in an open way. It is always done in a far more, subtle way. And I think, one of the things that we grapple with in a country like India, and this could be true for many African countries and others, is also a kind of a colonial hangover, right?
Yeah.
So that becomes both a weapon and an excuse. So while there are legitimate concerns about, like, like we said, we cannot access British Library archives,
Yeah.
right? So why should, someone not why should we not kind of scrutinize someone who wants access to our archives, right? So
Right.
there is always that question.
Quid pro
But at the
quo.
same time,
Yeah.
but at the same time, and that is always dangerous and a slippery slope for any government, east or west, is because, then it leads to then, doing that for your, for kind of monitoring, all
Mhm.
right? And surveilling what kind of work are you doing, what kind of research are you doing, and so on and so forth. So, and now the fear of that, all of that being recorded in some place,
Right.
right? So, so that kind of, Foucauldian surveillance seems to come back in a far more dangerous digital format, like,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Others? Okay. Yes, Setsuka, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So related to the question of accessibility, could you tell us more about the repatriation effort that you kind of showed us during your presentation? What does the repatriation of digital collection entail? Is it that people are able to access to the heritage that is theirs, regardless of where that is hosted, regardless of whose server they sit on? What does the repatriation of digital collections entail?
Yeah. I think this comes back to Takehiro's point, right? Which is to say, if something is digitized, why should it only be available to somebody in that country? It's such a simple, commonsensical point that labor has already gone into creating a collection. In the case of the Cornell University acquisitions, there are two, I forget, one is a Indian election archive and the other is the Bombay Poets Archive. I mean, you will be hard pressed to find this in the Indian subcontinent, like really hard pressed. And it's very sad that the people who've actually helped create those collections are themselves denied access because they're not members of that system. So if you're not a registered student or professor in the North American ecosystem or whatever their consortia let you access to, you're basically outside it, right? And Nirmala knows this better. The subscription rates are absolutely prohibitive. Many Indian universities don't allow for that kind of spend for library budgets. So for all those reasons, if you say do it as a paying model concept, you've already excluded too many people. And I don't only mean students. I think we have to rethink the university, rethink who's learning and what is the motivation, especially for history, because history as a discipline is seriously dying across the world. As an official professional discipline, there are very few jobs. It's deeply politicized. And contemporary stuff, especially like you mentioned, Nirmala, things are changing so fast that it's really ridiculous that you would not archive in real time, right? And make available also. So for many students and all that, 10 years ago is a blip, like they have no concept of what might have happened. So you can't say until it makes it to the deep archive, it will not be available to you. But I think the Repatriation Act is very simple. I think this is a huge talking point for Millie also, which is to say, and we are talking to the consortium of North American librarians for this, which is to say that if something exists online in the North American university system, but it's about Asia, South Asia, India specifically, is it so hard to give access to the public? Because we are half the world literally in terms of population, so you're excluding all of us and you're serving some very, very meager number of people. And even diaspora, right? There's so much Asian diaspora who are not academics, who are not historians, who don't want to study this for their projects. It's just curiosity. So hopefully for that reason, a lot of visual archiving, a lot of photographs, etc. Repatriation would just be you unleash the archive and you open it up to folks who wish to see or, yeah. So I hope in our lifetime that does happen.
Yes. I especially enjoy how it kind of transcends the national borders, which has always been blurry. But when it comes to digital, redlining, it can get really rigid. So I'm really appreciative of this framework. So thank you.
Thank you.
The 1947 partition archive is, that Maya is a personal peeve for me, always. Because the fact that it is paywalled and the fact that those are stories of survivors, right? Testimonials. of the partition, subcontinent partition is just, it just seems so wrong at so many levels, right?
Yeah.
That, you are in some ways, monetizing one of the largest what you call tragedies of the 20th century, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
so it's just like, and these are stories, and we need to know those stories, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we should have access to those stories, and like you said, not just scholars and students, but anyone who is curious and wants to know, right? And there's this whole scholarly question of how it is curated, how it is produced, and which might interest some of us. But there's also this question of, these are stories, and those stories should be able to cross borders, as Setsuko just said.
Yeah.
And I think more and more, as we, in migration studies, they say how, capital is mobile, but people are not. Capital crosses borders with ease that people cannot, right?
Right.
Similarly, I think in terms of, archives and repositories, the way the digital can travel borders very easily, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
so when we put jammers, or when we put, or restrict access, then the question becomes, the whys come into question, right?
Right.
So whether it is national governments, like on our side of the ocean, or like for whatever capitalist reasons, I
Yeah.
think those questions need to be asked, right? So I know we are out of time, but if there is any other question that I'm sure Maya is happy to take.
Yeah, I just wanted to share my screen one last time for this example. I think really beautifully done, the Digital Library of the Caribbean. And as you see, it has maps, it has other sorts of collections and partners. I think this is what I imagine for what the Asian region could do, to kind of override many of our challenges. And I know we've done it with religious, kind of manuscript collection and digitizing that. So I really hope that there is enough kind of, just imagination, honestly, to capture it. So I'm just pasting the link in case people would like to take a look at that. And it's interesting because the Caribbean is also not a country, right? In that sense, there's a variety of registers and patois and Creole and Spanish. But so in that same sense, it's never simple, but it's very necessary, in terms of going forward.
Well, I mean, any other questions, anyone?
Hi, can you hear me? Ishita here.
Hi,
Yes, please go ahead,
yeah,
Ishita.
hi.
Ishita.
Two questions. So, and playing the devil's advocate here, so bear with me. But one, when we say if there is a central repository, who would be the custodian? I mean, I think that's a very important question because archives are dealing with censorship, custodianship issues, and digital or physical. Yeah, I think we know what the repercussions would be. So that is one. And second, we are not really talking about the money, especially part of it when we talk about decentralizing archives and putting them together. It is very, very resource intensive. So it's easier said than done to make everything free access, but to sustain archival efforts, especially where as a context, I think we have deprivation of support and money coming in. How do you not charge? How do you not sustain an effort and just make it all open access out there? Yeah.
Honestly, the maintaining the platform, all of that, it's actually it's not that expensive, first of all. But the main point, I think your thing, which is about custodianship, is that it would have to be a neutral third party. It can be no single state government. It can be no one entity. And I'm thinking of things like ICANN, the people who give, what do they give? They give, I'm trying to say this right, like HTTP space, on the World Wide Web, what your domain names are. Yes, thank you. So, who gets the .in and who gets the .us or whatever. So I'm saying that there is a precedent for internet governance where you've had a third party administering across borders in a kind of and a representative way. And I think you also have it for Unicode You have it for wiki, right? It's a decentralized, but it's a third party. So it's not, it cannot be state owned. Now, Europeana and all were totally different because, of course, the EU had a lot of cooperative energy financially and such, right? Or in the case of Digital Public Library of America, also it's one country, fine. But I think if we're talking India, we have the, what is it called? The India Culture Portal, for instance, right? So the point is to say you're building a superstructure over these structures. So let's say there's somebody mentioned, I attended one of these. The Japanese library did a YouTube orientation of how you can discover what is in their archives. Very challenging, to be honest, but it exists, right? It exists. And so therefore, what happens when somebody takes that one level up and says, let me guide you to the Japanese archives, for instance, to find whatever you're looking for, Buddhist or something. As an Indian, I'm, let's say, looking for something like that. So I'm using the existing structures to have another layer that allows discoverability. So Europeana and such build on, let's say the Louvre has a collection or some museum in Florence has a collection, and you're just literally connecting all those collections as a platform. And they're not spending any money in digitizing. You're just literally identifying. So it's the discovery that requires the platform, that requires them to speak the same language, which is why it has to be interoperable, linked open data. And no one's asking that a country own it. It cannot be owned. It would have to be a non-profit model, like a Wikimedia, like a Creative Commons. They exist. You know, global cooperation does exist. And I'm not saying it has to be UN or something, but clearly the success stories of European and all were because they were already politically won. I don't think that will ever happen for the Asian region. But culturally speaking, I think there is such a beauty to how the early Jain, Buddhist, and such collections were done. And they were talking over 20 years. But that level of success, I feel it should be replicated in other cultural realms. It doesn't have to be state owned. The people have to be generous to say, okay, I'll put it in the open domain. I'm not asking Ishita for the labor from scratch. I completely agree with you that the amount of money it takes to digitize something is no joke. I'm talking about stuff that's already out there, just not accessible. So there's a difference in the labor of putting it out there versus listing it because it's already available. Just listing it to more. And the Cornell story will forever smart, you know, which is that there was nobody willing to take the Bombay Poets Archive in India to house it and to keep it and to display it. There was nobody. And this is Anjali Nirlikar's personal effort. Out of defeat, she gave it to Cornell. Adil Jusawala did not have anywhere to send it to. When Anjali looked, couldn't find, and so it sits at Cornell, and you and I don't have access. That's not okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you. Good, 11:36, little bit late, not too late, Asian time.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
we're doing fine.
I think, you know, thank you so much, Maya. And that was really, you know, you've given us so many things to think about. And especially the last point that you just made, you know, just triggered a lot of thoughts in me. So,
And I know Nirmala will find the funding for this, everyone, so you know who to look at.
yeah. Well, actually, you know, I mean, just what Ishita was saying and what you were saying, you know, the Indo-Swiss project that, you know, we are doing with EPLF Switzerland is actually creating a virtual museum of Buddhist sculptures.
Right, Sarnath, the digital twin, is it?
Yes, in
Okay.
Sarnath, in Sanchi, you know, and we hope to make it open access as a kind of a virtual museum, you know.
Beautiful.
And let's see, like, you know, how we kind of go about that curation and, you know, collection.
If there hadn't been those successes and that appetite, and I think it has been there specifically for religious heritage, right? I wouldn't have made this claim. But because we've kind of gone through such amazing, and I'm talking monasteries in Bhutan, Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, you know, kind of coming together to do this. Yeah, I know people think of religion in a very, like, you know, keep one arm's distance. But in terms of manuscript culture, that's where it is. So how can you ignore those successes with manuscript digitization? And based on that, all digital objects become equal, right? Like you just have to find a way to get them to talk to each other. But I hope, you know, the next decade sees equal cooperation. So
it reminds me of an old essay. Now I think it was David Berry, but I'm not sure. So forgive me if the citation is wrong. but who said that digital humanities or digitization does not care whether you want to digitize a contemporary book or a palm leaf manuscript. And the what is important is to see how that DOI is created and how it is deployed and used, right? So with that, here is to hoping that we have we have building, curating sustainable digital commons for everyone, especially in Asia. I also think that archiving processes both in technology as well as theoretically should be a core course in any DH curriculum, right? And thanks to Professor Dodd, a program that we are conceiving here does have that as one of the as one of the required courses. So
somebody
thank
just
you,
shared,
Maya.
Nirmala, on the chat, this Asian digital library. Thank you so much. And that's what I was saying. Please prove me wrong. Please tell me the platforms exist. Maybe sometimes it's just about expanding the scope of what already is. And this is why, we need more of these. And thank you, Setsuko, for putting it together. Such a joy, and what a great conversation, really. Thank you. So I'll let people get on with their day.
Yeah,
This
so
has
I'll
been
hand it over
fantastic.
back to Setsuko to close it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dodd and Dr. Menon, for this fantastic conversation. Thank you, Dr. Dodd, especially for sharing your research. And I know many of us in the room are eager to discuss more about this kind of Pan-Asian digital archival platform effort. So there's a discourse channel that you could join, and we can continue our conversation there. And thank you for those who asked very intriguing questions. This has been wonderful. Now, I need to be mindful of people's times. I need to call it a day. But please feel free to continue the conversation via Discord, via emails. Just to close off, our next webinar would be sometimes in late April, and I'll be sending out announcements once we work out the details. So stay tuned, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. So thank you to the speaker, thank you to the moderator, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thanks so much.